We're here today with Chancellor Marshall Criser of the State University System. Chancellor, thank you for giving us an opportunity to hear from you and a little bit about workforce and what it is that the State Board does.
Well, Bob, it's great to be here, and I'm delighted that you all are taking the time to talk to a lot of the stakeholders about what's going on between the business community and the education community.
Excellent. So tell us a little bit about what it is that the State University System's Board of Governors is and what is it that they do?
All right. Board of Governors is an appointed board by our governor. The board serves as the system-wide governing body of the 12 public universities in the state of Florida. I can go through that list, or just, if folks know who the public universities are, they'll be familiar with them. And I think that we have a strong interaction relationship also with the boards of trustees at those individual universities, which together between the Board of Governors and the Board of Trustees, I think gives us both a system level as well as an institutional level governance process.
Excellent. So whom does the Board of Governors work with to achieve its goals?
I think it's an ever-expanding list. Clearly, we have worked traditionally very closely with the academic community in terms of other sectors in the state of Florida. We work very closely with the colleges. We work also very closely with the private institutions in the state. And we spend a good deal of time working with agencies here in Tallahassee, with Department of Economic Opportunity, Career Source, Enterprise Florida, as well as business organizations, the Council of 100, Chamber of Commerce, AIF, Tax Watch. I'm going to forget somebody, so I'm going to be in trouble, but that's, I think I've covered it.
Excellent. So a lot of times when we think about the state university system, we think about production of degrees and we think about graduates and people going to work, but what got the board interested in modeling workforce supply and demand, and why is that important?
Okay. I think there's really probably two big initiatives. One was started by one of our former chairs, Dean Colson, who actually launched an access and attainment study that completed its work back in 2013. What was distinctive about that was it was an effort to work collaboratively, again, with those stakeholders that I just mentioned. Actually, at that time, I was there, I think, representing the business community when we went through that process. But our focus to that was to understand what the demand was, what the need was in Florida for undergraduate degrees from an employer perspective, not from an academic perspective, but from an employer perspective, and understand where the major gaps were between degree production and what our employers in the state of Florida were telling us that they needed. Not just currently, but looking forward. And so as a result of that work, I think we were able to fine-tune and really hone some of the discussion within the university community about degree production. Subsequent to that, our board has also developed within its performance and accountability model a set of programs or degrees that we call programs of strategic emphasis. Same kind of discussion. These are looking at Florida's economy today, Florida's economy in the future, understanding where we need to be in terms of producing degrees, and having a very active conversation with our universities about how we can move toward, and in some cases tailor an education program for a student that's going to match them with a degree that matches them with a job.
Very good. You've answered this to some degree, but how do we align our degree production goals with our economic and workforce needs in Florida?
We work closely with Department of Economic Opportunity, as well as working with Career Source and working with business organizations. Again, I think part of that is we listen. It is important for anyone engaged in this conversation to understand what the priorities are of other stakeholders. And so we're working at a state level with those organizations. We're also working with business organizations. Been very active in the last year, not only with the Council 100, but with groups like the Florida Chamber of Commerce, which is doing a tremendous amount of work right now looking at a Florida 2030 view and trying to understand how well we're aligning not just university and undergraduate or graduate degrees, but looking also at associate degrees and certificates that our employers are telling us that they need employees who've attained those kinds of credentials. Not a matter of just getting a piece of paper, it's actually giving an individual a skill set, something that they can build with and build on, but also leads them to a job now that Florida's employers are telling us that they need.
Any personal thoughts on how those relationships and partnerships could be tightened and ways to work more effectively together?
I think tightening is probably something that's already being done by the leaders in those groups, but it's been, I guess it's something I've believed for a long time now, and I kind of simplify it to say we all need to use the same vocabulary, the same definitions. When we're doing workforce demand studies or we're looking at degree production, we all need to be using the same template for understanding exactly how we calculate what we're doing now and what the gaps may be in the future. If we're using different methodologies, then we're going to convince ourselves that we're all headed in the right direction, but it's almost inevitable that we won't collectively be going there. Whereas if we are common, this is something we did in access and attainment, it was probably the big lift on the front end, was actually agreeing to how the methodology would be developed and how we would work through that process so that we had basically a common language that spoke the same thing to the academic side as it does to the employer side.
So, what types of data do we use when we're looking at labor market demand?
We are looking at a great deal of information that we get through the Department of Economic Opportunity, particularly looking at the Bureau of Labor Statistics data and understanding sort of how Florida fits in not only a state level analysis, but as well as a national level. I think one of the things that I was reminded by Career Source at one point, it's kind of interesting, we always need to remember this. Regional data is aggregated up to become state data, and state data is aggregated up to become national data. Therefore, if we go back to this idea that we need to be talking about the same vocabulary, the same methodology, those piece parts add up and the things that you may need in order to really understand demand and supply. Where are graduates moving into Florida, as well as where are graduates moving out of the state of Florida, so that we understand, not just what we produce in terms of degrees, but what we produce in terms of individuals who take those degrees and stay in our state or move to our state.
Good. So there in statute, there's a provision for a workforce estimating conference.
Yeah.
It's been enacted the last several years, but do you have any personal opinions about that estimating conference, its usefulness, anything that you all would like to see from a Board of Governors standpoint that you all would like to see done differently than what we're doing today?
I think you can always strengthen or improve something. It's been I guess from a different perspective, I came at this years ago and said we needed to have a degree estimating conference. We needed to collectively on the education side, public, private, colleges, universities, talk about what it is we anticipate producing in terms of degrees. I think you match that with the conversation we're having with DEO and with Career Source and other lead agencies in the state. You match that with what employers can come in, not just with current demand, but actually looking at long-term demand in the state and how we want to see our economy grow. It becomes complicated in part because you have new businesses. We now have GKN out in the Panhandle. We have Arthrex down in Southwest Florida. And at the same time, you've got groups like Northrop Grumman and Lockheed Martin who are expanding their businesses. It's a very active, dynamic process that we need to go through. But the more of that we do, I think the better we're all going to be. And so if a workforce estimating process becomes, it's got to be more than just something you do. It's got to be a very active, dynamic, everybody's engaged. We agree to how we're going to have the conversation on the front end. I think it can be a very dynamic thing for the state of Florida.
Wonderful. Thank you, Chancellor. This was Chancellor Criser with the State University System Board of Governors.